As I begin today, I'd like you to be thinking about this question. What has most shaped your view of the earth and all of its creatures and all of its resources? What people, what experiences, what teaching, what beliefs have helped form the view you now hold? Because people have very different views of the earth. From very utilitarian, which is simply, what can I get out of it to benefit myself, to a view of creation as sacred. My view began with my mother. My mother was always pointing out to my sisters and myself birds and animals and flowers and trees, the sunlight, the sky, the moon, and the stars. She just always calling those things to our attention. And in the summer up in Maine, we'd go blueberry picking among the cathedral pines at the end of our street. We'd go apple picking in the fall. My mom was just so connected to nature. And I'm going to date myself with these next two things here, okay? But on television, we would watch The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau. Any of you remember that program, which had great underwater photography and always talked about conservation? The other show we watched was Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. Remember that one, some of you? With Marlon Perkins and Jim Fowler. And even as a little kid, I always thought it was funny that Marlon Perkins was the big name, but he was always sitting safely and comfortably back in the TV studio while Jim Fowler was out wrestling a water buffalo for his life or something somewhere in Africa. It always was like that. I also learned when I was very young in the household that I grew up in the biblical view that the earth is the Lord's, and that it was to be treated well, with care, and with the understanding that it didn't belong to us, that we belong to it for a time, and then we pass it on to the next generation, hopefully better than we found it. And all those experiences were part of shaping my view of the earth, as was my first job, which I've mentioned to you before, which was picking up litter in Maine when I was 10 years old, which created in me a lifelong passion about people who litter and littering, along with perhaps what was probably the greatest public service commercial ever, which was the anti-littering ad of the early 70s with the Native American standing there looking with a tear running down his face. I mean, how anybody could litter after watching that commercial, I just will never understand. But it's not just all the things that you see in nature. There are all kinds of cool sounds in nature as well. I shared on my Facebook page not too long ago how much I look forward in the fall and the spring to the migrating large flocks of grackles that come through the Cape. And grackles, if you're not into birds, are like blackbirds. They're very dark. They have glossy, kind of iridescent bodies, and their head and neck are very shimmery blue. And this time of year, you see them in large groups walking on lawns or going through treetops. And so I often throw sunflower seeds out in our backyard in the late afternoon because they often come through later in the day, and presumably because then they're migrating in the evening. And so the other day I could hear them coming. I was actually driving back home through my neighborhood, and they were already on Greenland Pond Road. So I got home, and I just went out on my deck and waited because they just moved through. And they make so much noise. I mean, they're like church people after a service. They're just all, they're really squawking a lot. And as they moved through the oak trees in our backyard, it just started raining acorns. Raining acorns. A thump, 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 thump of all these acorns coming down, and they're all making. And when they moved on, the quiet was so loud. You know what I mean? The stillness. When I go to Maine, as I did last month, Jill and I we walk by what I used to call, when I was about your age, what I used to call the pollywog pond. And I love hearing the sounds of the frogs, doing their ribbiting thing there. It's beautiful. And one more sound, which I always think of this time of the year, is I love hearing the sound of the wind in the leaves in the trees because I know it's leaving and that we only have the sound of the wind in the trees for a couple more weeks, and then I won't hear it here again until sometime in April, usually late April. And I always love when that comes around again also, the first time in the spring when the leaves are out enough and the wind blows and you hear it. I'm glad you all enjoy these things as much as I do, I can tell from. But if you listen closely to life, if we listen closely to life, it's amazing the things you can hear and notice. And that's also the case in today's Dr. Seuss story. Horton hears a who, which begins, "On the 15th of May in the jungle of Newell, in the heat of the day, in the cool of the pool, he was splashing, enjoying the jungle's great joys, when Horton the elephant heard a small noise. So Horton stopped splashing. He looked toward the sound. That's funny, thought Horton. There's no one around. Then he heard it again, just a very faint yelp, as if some tiny person were calling for help. I'll help you, said Horton, but who are you? Where? He looked and he looked. He could see nothing there but a small speck of dust blowing past through the air. I say, murmured Horton, I've never heard tell of a small speck of dust that is able to yell. So you know what I think? Why, I think that there must be someone on top of that small speck of dust, some sort of creature of very small size, too small to be seen by an elephant's eyes, some poor little person who's shaking with fear that he'll blow in the pool. He has no way to steer. I'll just have to save him because, after all, a person's a person, no matter how small. So Horton takes that speck of dust and he puts it on a very soft clover. Horton Hears a Who, thank you. Horton Hears a Who is the second Dr. Seuss story featuring that large, loving, and lovable elephant, Horton. You may remember him from Horton Hatches the Egg in the sermon in September on being faithful 100%. Thank you, that sermon's right there. Well, in this story, Horton, who always seems to function as sort of a godlike figure, hears a sound that none of the other animals can hear. Their ears aren't sensitive enough to hear the cries of the who's in Whoville. And it is interesting to me that he uses who's in Whoville again in another story that we may hear in December. But anyway, the who's entire world, with who's of all ages and houses and streets and churches and grocery stores, exists on a tiny speck of dust. And so Horton, after he places that speck of dust that houses the who's entire world onto the soft clover there, and he tells the other animals about it, and they all think he's crazy. They think he's crazy, and they start to make fun of him, and they insult him, and they scheme to get rid of it. And an eagle picks up the clover with all of the who's and flies and drops it into a field with millions of others. And Horton is crestfallen. But Horton, ever faithful, he searches for that clover. He searches and searches faithfully until he finds them on the 3 millionth flower. That's a lot of searching. But Horton's relief is short-lived because the other animals show up and they're so tired of Horton's behavior, they try to tie him up and they're going to try to get rid of him, and they threaten to boil the speck of dust with the who's world on it in oil and finish with it forever. So Horton is desperate and he pleads with the who's. He tells them, you've got to all make noise. You've got to make enough noise, the loudest sound they can, so that everyone can hear them and will believe that Horton is telling the truth, that the who's exist. And the who's try, but it's not enough. It's not enough. Only Horton's ears are sensitive enough to hear them, and he and the who's are in great, great danger. And that's where we'll leave them for a while. I will get back to them. In reading Horton Hears a Who, There's some parts of the story, if you were to read the whole thing, where you may identify with the who's. You may feel like, there's times when I feel like no one is listening to me. No one can hear my cries. Does anyone even know I exist? We can feel very small at times in life. There are other times we may identify more with Horton. And in our efforts we want to hear the cries of a groaning world. We hear them. We look around. We see all the needs. And like Horton, we want to help. We want to come to the aid of the world. And the passage that Mary read to us from Romans chapter 8 states that all of creation is groaning and moaning for redemption, for the people of God to be the people of God. Now, the Bible's teaching is very clear that God is a creator of the heavens and the earth, and life itself is a gift from God. And today's scripture from Psalm 24, which is also at the top of your bulletin, it's a good one to memorize, is the earth is the Lord's. You really can't say it more unequivocally than that. The earth is the Lord's, and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it, for he has founded it on the seas and established it on the rivers. There are many, many scriptures from the story of creation in the beginning of Genesis to many of the Psalms, including Psalm 8 and Psalm 19 and 29 and 104 and 139, and I could go on, and passages from Isaiah and Romans and Ephesians and Colossians that all make it clear the earth is the Lord's, and we are God's people. We are the sheep of his pasture, and we are to be God's caretakers, God's stewards, God's gardeners, if you will. And humanity in the beginning was placed in the center of the creation to care for it. And the message is clear. We don't own the world, but as God's caretakers, we're to hear and respond to the world's cries. Now, it's very unfortunate, it seems to me, that caring for creation is something that Christians have not done as well as we should. And because of our view of God as the creator and the earth of belonging to the Lord, Christians have a biblical mandate that too often has just been ignored. And I want to be really clear. Caring for creation is not a political issue. It is not a liberal or conservative issue. It's about obeying and being faithful to biblical teaching. Very clear biblical teaching. The American Baptists came out with a statement about caring for creation 25 years ago. I mean, this isn't a new thing. And even the Southern Baptists have produced a 4-part statement about our responsibility to care for the earth and its people, creatures, and resources responsibly. I mean, the Southern Baptists, I never quote from the Southern Baptists. And even the Southern Baptists really got this right. They said in part at the end of their statement, we realize that simply affirming our God-given responsibility to care for the earth will likely produce no tangible or effective results. Therefore, we pledge to find ways to curb ecological degradation through promoting biblical stewardship habits and increasing awareness in our homes, in our businesses where we find influence, in our relationships with others, and in our local churches. Many of our churches do not actively preach, promote, or practice biblical creation care. We urge churches to begin doing so. Failing to practice caring for creation is often a reflection of either just ignorance, people don't know any better, of greed, selfishness, apathy, or indifference. And as far back, though, as the prophet Isaiah, we can read about the consequences of what happens when people don't fulfill the covenant that God has created with us. In Isaiah 24, verses 5 and 6, it says, "The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed laws, violated statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth dwindled, and few people are left." That makes it pretty clear, when we don't do what we're supposed to do, people suffer, and the earth and its creatures suffer. And the images that Isaiah used more than 2,500 years ago are still visible in many places around the world today because of our irresponsibility as creatures is harming God's creation. The creation that God made is, to use an old fairy tale image, it is the golden goose that has allowed life and prosperity to flourish. And yet if we're not careful, our habits and our choices are going to kill the golden goose. And when human beings break the covenant that God made with us to care for God's creation, we all suffer, some more than others. And let's face it, part of what caused many of us to want to live on Cape Cod is because this part of God's creation is still so beautiful, right? That's part of why so many of us want to be here. Now, some people don't believe in a creator, so they don't feel any responsibility to care for creation on God's behalf. But I really enjoyed this passage I read. It's in a book called An Outsider's Guide to the Gospels by a man named Mick Mooney. And he wrote about why, even if someone doesn't believe in the Bible, they should believe in a creator. He said the whole cosmos in their perfectly functioning glory, where did it all come from? From nowhere? Are we to believe it is all the result of one mind-boggling chance? To believe this is to accept the odds given to it. One scientific estimate puts the chance of random creation at 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. That's 1 in 10 plus followed by 40,000 zeros. That's a lot of zeros. Is it realistic to accept these odds as the most rational explanation we have regarding the creation of the universe? The observable universe is estimated to be more than 93 billion light years in length. 93 billion light years in length. To put this in perspective, the moon, for example, is less than 2 light seconds away. That's a big universe. I wouldn't want to have to clean it. And that universe is perfectly balanced. Everything in it works in perfect union with each other. And within this universe, we have our planet, which, so far as we know to this point, is unique in all the universe. And on our planet, we have the most fascinating variety of animals, foods, smells, tastes, and visual spectacles from the tiniest insect to the great whales and every living creature in between. And while I can still stare out at the stars and the galaxies, all those millions of light years away, whose light is powerful enough to still reach my eyes, regardless of the gulf between us, I can do nothing else but believe there is a creator behind it all. Well, the church has always confessed that God is the maker of heaven and earth and of all the things within them. And this conviction really has great implications for the way we view the world around us. Because we believe that God made it and that it's sacred, we care for this world. We see the beauty in this world. We notice it. We appreciate it. We recognize God's glory expressed in it, and we aim to protect it, and we grieve when it's abused and damaged. And the church also confesses that God has made all human beings in God's own image, male and female, old and young, strong and weak. As Horton said, a person's a person, no matter how small. And we all carry the stamp of God's image as moral, ethical, and spiritual beings called into a unique covenant relationship with our Creator. And this conviction leads us to view each human being as having God-given dignity and worth and value and deserving of respect and care and honor. And these convictions have implications for our worship. I mean, in worship, we give thanks and praise for creation. We offer prayers for God's blessing in different seasons of the year. In certain times of the year, we may really call out to God for help, as we're doing now, as Mary did in her prayer this morning. Huey Lewis and the News, it's a musical group I like. They're very old for some of you who are younger, but Huey Lewis and the News have a song. It's a small, small world. It's not the song they do at Walt Disney. But in their song, Small World, it says, some people take and they never give. Got to learn to give and take. if we want to live. Now, we can fight one another like they do on TV, or we can help one another the way it's supposed to be. If we all give a little, it could really mean a lot. It's a small, small world, but it's the only one we've got. And if you want to think more selfishly about caring for creation, I would just encourage you to consider and remember the sign in the window of the Chatham Candy Manor. If you know this, some of you are nodding. It's the sign that says, "Save the Earth." It's our only source of chocolate. So whatever you need to motivate you. At the end of Horton Hears a Who, it turns out that there was one very, very small shirker named Jojo who wasn't doing his part to help save his people and his world. He wasn't making a sound. He was just bouncing a yo-yo up and down in his living room. So the mayor, as you can see in this picture, the mayor grabs him and climbs with the lad up the Eiffelberg Tower. And it says, "This," cried the mayor, "is your town's darkest hour. The time for all whos who have blood that is red to come out to the..." It's so small I can't even read it. "Now is the time for all whos who have blood that is red to come to the aid of their country. We've got to make noises in greater amounts. So open your mouth, lad, for every voice counts." And the lad cleared his throat and shouted out, "Yup." And that small extra yop put it over the top, and all the animals could hear the whos. Just leave that slide up. All the animals could hear the whos, and they vowed to protect them, and they believed Horton, and they proved that they are persons no matter how small, and their whole world was saved by the smallest of all. And they all vowed to protect them from sun in the summer, from rain when it's fallish. I'm going to protect them no matter how smallish. Well, just as Horton heard the cries of the whos, and God hears our cries, we also are to hear the cries of creation and to fulfill our God-given task to be responsible caretakers of God's good creation. Last Sunday, I don't know how many of you read the Sunday Globe, but there was an article in the travel section last Sunday about people, the increase in people going on vacation to family farms. Have any of you ever stayed at a farm while you were on vacation anywhere? A couple of us have. It's a neat experience, and it's a neat experience especially for kids. And they quoted Beth Kennett, who with her husband runs Liberty Hill Farm and Inn in Rochester, Vermont. Last year they were named Innkeeper of the Year by the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. And she said, "People can't go back to Grandma and Grandpa's farm anymore, so Bob and I become Grandma and Grandpa for a lot of families." She said, "It's also kind of an antidote to the whole Disney thing, or an escape for parents who see their kids on video games all day. Swinging on a tire swing and feeding baby calves is a completely different universe than where they live." How many of you grew up on a farm? Anybody? Couple in the back? Most of us don't grow up on farms anymore. There was a time when a lot of people, especially in America, the majority of the people, lived on a farm. And if you lived on a farm, you managed the land and the resources, knowing that if things went well, you would pass that farm on to your children and on to your grandchildren. And so you had that real sense. And I think we need that kind of perspective for the whole earth. We need to look at the whole earth like it's the family farm. You know, and it was passed on to us, and we're going to be here for a while, but we're passing it on. As somebody said, we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And we want to leave them a healthy, beautiful place to live, better than we found it. Because it's a small, small world, but it's the only one we've got. Let's pray. God, our Creator, we thank you for all that you have made. We thank you for the beauty all around us, especially on Cape Cod and here in October with the foliage and the birds migrating, as Patty prayed earlier in the service. And help us remember every day, always to take care of your world for Jesus' sake. Amen.